a wide pit opened in the rocky ground, shaped by natural erosion and expanded by human labor decades ago. The place was called the Pit Prison, though the official designation on legal documents used another term that nobody cared to memorize. The entrance was located at the top of a steep drop, where a wooden lift dangled on thick chains. Guards controlled the lift from a reinforced platform, watching inmates come and go with the same detachment they showed when they threw scraps of food into the dust. The wood on the lift was warped and damp, stained by the sweat of those who had ridden it downward for the last time. Inside the pit stretched a network of caves connected by slopes, jagged tunnels, and primitive ladders. Portions of the cave system reached hundreds of yards underground. Stale air made it difficult to breathe, and some passages contained pockets of foul-smelling water that collected in hollows. Light sources were limited to torches, improvised lamps fueled by leftover fats, and the occasional glow from a hole in the cavern ceiling. Guards rarely ventured past the top area, preferring to maintain control by limiting movement on the lift. The prisoners had formed a strict hierarchy. Several large gangs dominated the cavern's key areas, claiming the more accessible tunnels and the corners where water dripped from cracks in the ceiling. Smaller groups and lone inmates were forced to pay tribute in the form of supplies, stolen goods, or forced labor. Those who refused risked savage beatings. The guards allowed these internal rules to stand. Their interest was limited to keeping the numbers stable and ensuring no mass exodus ever occurred. Once a month, a motorized truck arrived near the edge of the pit. Bags of food and water jugs were shoved onto the wooden lift or tossed over the side without care. The guards bet on how many inmates would die during the scramble for the supplies. Thuds echoed through the deep shaft when the bags landed on bodies. The guards laughed as they observed the chaos, yelling at each other about the probability of broken limbs and spilled blood. Michael stood apart from this brutality. He had no gang, preferring to rely on his own instincts. He occupied one of the farthest caves, where he slept on a makeshift cot fashioned from old blankets and discarded metal rods. He had discovered a narrow tunnel behind a cracked boulder that led to a ledge slightly above ground level. From there, he could see much of the cavern floor. He had placed small rocks in piles along the approach to his cave so he would hear intruders. He lived without friends or allies. In the pit prison, friends were dangerous. That day, the monthly supply drop arrived. The first sack landed on an unlucky inmate, crushing his collarbone. Another rolled down a slope, trailed by 5 men. Within seconds, fists connected with jaws, and shouts filled the air. One bag opened on impact, spilling canned goods and water packs. Inmates pounced on them, only to be kicked aside by bigger men from the lead gangs. The guards roared with amusement. Michael waited in the shadows near a bend in the rock. When the fighting erupted, he monitored the swirling crowd. His mind stayed focused on the edges, knowing that lone survivors or opportunists might separate from the chaos. He spotted a man who had managed to snatch a sealed bag. This man clutched it against his chest while slipping around the outskirts of the brawl. Michael followed him for about 30 yards, watching the man's frantic steps. The man glanced over his shoulder every few seconds, as if expecting to be ambushed. When the moment felt right, Michael lunged from behind, striking the man at the base of the neck with a short length of pipe. The blow knocked him to the ground. Michael seized the bag, then scanned his surroundings. He noted that nobody had seen him. Screams and combat still echoed from the center of the cavern. Michael retreated to his cave, breathing hard from the tension rather than the short struggle. Once inside, he placed the stolen bag on a flat stone shelf he used as a table. He knelt to check if the man had followed him, but the tunnel entrance was silent. Michael listened to faint sounds from the main cavern. He told himself that survival justified any action. He opened the bag and saw packets of dried food, several water pouches, and a few meager medical items. These were small treasures in a place where infection often led to a slow death. He stacked them meticulously, ensuring everything was in order. He recalled the past several years of his life, recognizing how much had changed. He rested on his cot, letting the adrenaline subside. His hands felt steady, and his mind sifted through possibilities. He had learned to live alone. He had no other choice in the pit prison. Michael remembered the day he was handed a sealed file in a dim office far from public view. The mission was clear: eliminate a powerful political figure who threatened the stability of a volatile region. Michael was a covert operative, trained to move without leaving traces. He had followed the instructions, stalked his target in distant suburbs, and carried out the plan with efficiency. His extraction was supposed to be swift and unnoticed. He recalled the signal to rendezvous on a deserted street corner. Nobody arrived. Instead, an armored vehicle blocked the road, and men with black uniforms aimed rifles at him. One of them called him by name and told him to drop his weapon. He complied, certain it was an unforeseen twist that would be resolved by the chain of command. He was wrong. They placed him in restraints and covered his head with a hood. He later learned the government that employed him had labeled him a threat. He had fulfilled his objective, and then he became an inconvenient witness. Documents with sensitive details had vanished, leaving him vulnerable. An official denied his existence, turning him from an asset into a liability. His pleas were ignored. The next thing he knew, he was in the pit prison, forced to ride the creaking wooden lift down into darkness. Now he existed in a place where no conventional law applied. The pit had its own rules, written by muscle and cunning. He recognized that his former training only gave him a slight advantage. Firearms were scarce, and the environment demanded a different survival approach. Negotiation, stealth, and observation became more important than direct confrontation. He had found ways to remain neutral in disputes. He provided small services to multiple groups, never giving them a reason to suspect disloyalty. He would pass along harmless pieces of intelligence about rival plans, carefully ensuring no one side gained too much power. He avoided revealing his past identity. He was simply Michael, a man who knew how to gather resources quietly. He spent days examining the labyrinthine layout of the caves. He discovered hidden passages where the rock formed narrow channels. He found spots where the humidity was lower, offering a drier place to store small rations. He learned that alliances were fragile. He also recognized that direct involvement with any gang placed him under permanent suspicion. Survival demanded distance. Over time, he developed a personal creed. No commitments, no friendship, no compromise. He had seen large men cripple smaller rivals for a handful of water. He had watched guards drop fresh supplies on top of unsuspecting inmates. His conscience had faded. He recalled the life he had before, but it felt distant. He no longer believed in honor. The pit allowed no illusions. He was still alive because he never stood still when danger approached, and he took from others before they could take from him. He now sat in his cave, staring at a small tin of protein powder he had stolen earlier. He recognized a simple truth. The skills he once relied on would not protect him indefinitely. Michael awoke to an unsettling quiet. He rose from his makeshift cot and peered out of the narrow passage that overlooked the main cavern floor. Dim torchlight cast long shadows against uneven walls. Movement was visible in the distance, where a few individuals scurried toward a known trading spot near the southeast tunnels. In the pit, each day presented a fresh hazard. There was no unified administration among the inmates. Gang leaders set their own rules, enforced by threats and daily acts of violence. The guards above tolerated these arrangements because they benefited from stable inmate populations and contraband schemes. No official code existed. Strength, strategy, and intimidation decided who ate and who starved. The largest gangs shaped much of life in the pit. The brown shirts, composed of men who boasted about their extremist views on race and power, dominated certain weapon trades. They crafted knives and sharpened steel spikes out of leftover metal scraps. They also demanded tribute from weaker inmates, promising protection in return. Michael had seen them roam the corridors, targeting anyone who did not pay their weekly ration of food or stolen goods. Their presence created a climate of fear. Another dominant group was the Red Killers, made up mostly of men who came from the inner cities. Their leader controlled a portion of the monthly supply drops by stationing his most loyal members near the central drop zone. They seized the largest share of the supplies, selling or trading them later. Water, especially, was sold at high rates, and many inmates were forced into debt. Anyone who attempted to bypass their distribution was beaten. The Red Killers had a strict hierarchy that demanded loyalty and obedience. The Irish Brigade operated on different principles. They specialized in outside connections, slipping bribes to certain guards in exchange for goods that were rarely found in the pit. Cigarettes, liquor, and limited medication arrived in hidden crates and changed hands through back corridors. Their leader maintained a careful balance by collaborating with other influential gangs, ensuring nobody singled out the Irish as an easy target. Rumors existed that the Irish Brigade possessed the means to arrange a quiet exit from the pit for a significant price, though no one had ever publicly confirmed such a transaction. Another group, the Silent Dragons, ran gambling rings and produced narcotic compounds from fungi and odd plants that grew in damp corners of the caves. They operated discreetly. Their presence was felt through the swirling tension of drug disputes that erupted among inmates who owed them money. The dragons rarely announced their power through open displays of violence. They simply found those who failed to pay, and those individuals never reappeared. Smaller bands drifted between these main factions. Some were united by shared nationality, some by old bonds from life on the outside. They claimed minor tunnels and staked out sections that others deemed less profitable. They survived by staying neutral or by offering specialized services. Information was valuable, as was skill in forging tools or cultivating hidden patches of edible fungus. Michael had no desire to join any of these groups. He recognized the constant betrayals and the paranoia that infected everyone who lived in this place. He observed their movements from a distance. He rarely entered the so-called market, but he knew it was a critical zone for transactions. Stalls lined the edges of a broad chamber. Some sold makeshift weapons. Others sold diluted liquor that could ease physical pain for a short while. There were corners where rumors spread quickly. Prisoners whispered about possible escape routes or new contraband shipments from the guards. On certain nights, the market offered crude entertainment. People gambled, made bets, and occasionally staged fistfights for small prizes. Behind the surface, a stark reality prevailed. The bigger gangs set extortion prices on water and food. Anyone violating their terms risked death or exile to the darkest areas of the pit, where cave-ins and foul air were common. Michael had come close to being trapped there once, years ago, while trying to evade a group that demanded half his rations. He had escaped by crawling through a tight crevice, emerging with scraped elbows and bruises along his back. He continued living as a lone survivor. He found side pathways where few ventured. He stole supplies when the opportunity arose. He observed the tension between gangs, recognizing that alliances shifted frequently. He saw men align with one group, then desert them for a better offer, only to be hunted down later. In this environment, trust did not exist. Power belonged to those who seized it without hesitation. That morning, he watched a cluster of armed inmates block access to a well near the north wall. They belonged to a smaller band that wanted to establish a new toll. An argument broke out, followed by a short brawl. One man collapsed, clutching his side. Blood pooled beneath him. The others grabbed weapons and prepared to retaliate. This scene reminded Michael that the pit was a kind of arena, lacking any moral restraint. That realization echoed through his mind each time he saw cruelty become routine. He drew back into his cave, aware that survival depended on maintaining a low profile. He heard distant shouts and recognized the dull thud of a club meeting flesh. The pit was not a place for mercy. Resources were finite. Everyone had their own code, shaped by hunger and desperation. Michael quietly waited, calculating his next steps. He understood that existing alone in these conditions required constant vigilance, but he also believed it was safer than relying on others who would betray him for a morsel of bread. A man named Rook sat in a makeshift booth constructed from scrap lumber and sheet metal. This was one of many stalls in the bustling black market located in a widened chamber that echoed with low voices and the clang of improvised tools. Rook specialized in sneaking contraband through hidden arrangements with certain guards. He paid them generously with stolen goods or currency smuggled in from outside. Inmates came to him for items that could not be obtained in regular trade, such as special blades, rare booze, or advanced medical supplies. Michael stood near a corner, observing the flow of commerce. He saw men barter chunks of dried meat for battered water jugs. One stall sold sharpened rods and another dealt in homemade bandages. Alcohol was popular, though much of it was impure. The smell of cheap liquor floated through the chamber. The black market also included places where inmates engaged in gambling. Rook's table was stacked with battered crates, and his runners haggled with customers to finalize prices. Farther down, the brown shirts controlled a section where they displayed their homemade weaponry. They maintained a strict lookout to prevent theft. Prisoners looking to acquire knives or spike-studded clubs needed to pay in supplies or personal belongings. Some exchanged clothing, trading warmth for protection. Michael noted a separate stall where opium-like narcotics changed hands, managed by a subgroup associated with the Silent Dragons. The pungent odor from that area created a haze that lingered along the ceiling. Guards rarely appeared this deep in the pit. They understood the economy here served their interests as well. Bribes, stolen valuables, and illicit payments ensured that the contraband pipeline remained open. Certain gangs could offer the guards labor or even savage entertainment, enabling the men above to maintain a steady income. Rumors suggested that sometimes guards staged fights in the pit for wealthy spectators on the outside, but Michael had never witnessed such a spectacle. He dismissed many rumors as exaggerations from inmates seeking attention. Within this setting, the big gangs asserted dominance over certain goods. The Red Killers demanded a percentage from every vendor who sold food or water, and the Irish Brigade maintained quiet influence by circulating whiskey and pills at premium prices. The Brown Shirts established a presence wherever weapons were forged or sold. The Silent Dragons had discreet agents who monitored gambling tables, collecting debts when individuals could not pay. Michael understood that his survival depended on not crossing these organizations. He preferred to remain invisible when possible. He purchased small necessities without drawing attention, He sometimes traded information about the location of hidden caches or stashes left behind by careless newcomers. This approach kept him outside direct conflict. After finishing an exchange of cigarettes for a modest ration of preserved bread, Michael walked back through the winding paths, noting how certain areas were lit by flickering torches. He listened to whispered negotiations between smaller bands seeking alliances against stronger groups. He also watched for sudden bursts of violence, which often erupted if someone refused to pay a toll or attempted to steal. Along one passage he saw a group of frightened inmates. They had been exiled from a gang for breaking some unwritten rule. Their faces were gaunt and their clothing torn. They lingered near the darkest part of the tunnel, uncertain whether to flee deeper or return and beg forgiveness. Exile in the pit was usually a death sentence. No safe zone existed beyond the established territory. Michael silently passed them. He recognized that intervening would yield no benefit. Compassion was dangerous in a place where debts rarely went unpaid. By the time he returned to his solitary corner, he had witnessed more evidence that the pit operated on fear, greed, and an endless cycle of dominance. He understood that each transaction at the black market was a negotiation for survival. Consequences followed every deal. Anger flared quickly, and hidden loyalties sparked sudden betrayals. He remembered that truth from his own mistakes in the past. He chose to remain watchful and quiet. He settled into his small cave at the edge of a narrow passage and observed a pair of distant torches flickering against the walls. He knew this was not merely a prison. It was a reflection of how people behaved when confined without laws or hope. He had learned to adapt, forming temporary connections without trusting anyone. He believed that the pit was a proving ground that demanded constant vigilance. He had no illusions about escape. Michael left a corner booth where he had been gambling with 3 men. The makeshift bar that housed the booth stood in a neutral section of the pit, at least nominally. It was constructed from stacked rocks and salvaged steel. Its floor was uneven, and the seating consisted of crates or broken chairs scavenged from the dump site near the lift. The place attracted inmates seeking a short distraction through cards, dice, or strong alcohol that numbed the senses. The overhead torches flickered, creating shifting shadows on the walls. Michael had spent the last hour focusing on the card game, hoping to distract himself from the constant pressures of life here. He had earned a handful of cigarettes and lost half of them in a subsequent round. Overall, he considered it a fair outcome. He wanted to leave before the tension escalated, as it often did when players started accusing each other of cheating. He stepped into the damp corridor. It smelled of wet stone and stale sweat. The voices from the bar receded behind him. He adjusted his jacket, which was patched and worn from years of rough living, then began walking toward the path that would eventually lead to his hidden cave. He rounded a bend and nearly collided with a tall man who stumbled forward, reeking of alcohol. Michael recognized the man as the leader of a smaller but aggressive faction that had recently aligned with the brown shirts. The man's eyes were red and his breath was labored. He bumped Michael's shoulder and demanded an apology. Michael paused, trying to calm the situation by stepping aside and indicating he was leaving, but the leader grew agitated. When the leader tried to shove him again, Michael resisted by gripping the man's wrist. This triggered a string of curses from the leader, who yelled for his men. Within moments, 3 gang members emerged from a side passage. They cornered Michael in a confined area where the walls narrowed. One of them brandished a jagged piece of metal with taped cloth as a handle. Another clenched his fists. Michael recognized that negotiations were pointless. The leader kept shouting, calling Michael a coward who needed to learn respect. Michael kept silent, waiting for an opening. The first attacker lunged, swinging the sharpened metal. Michael sidestepped and brought his elbow down on the attacker's forearm. The weapon clattered on the ground. Another attacker tried to pin Michael's arms, but Michael slammed his heel against the man's kneecap. The man howled in pain and collapsed. The leader advanced, throwing a punch at Michael's abdomen. Michael managed to block part of the blow, though pain rippled through his midsection. He staggered but recovered his footing. He seized a broken plank lying against the wall. He swung it upward, catching the leader across the shoulder. The man groaned and stumbled backward, losing his balance. Michael used that moment to retrieve the dropped metal shard. He gripped it firmly, ignoring the sweat on his palms. One gang member rushed him. Michael slashed at the man's ribs. The improvised blade cut through fabric and caused the attacker to double over in agony. Another man grabbed at Michael's neck. Michael twisted sideways, slamming his forearm into the attacker's face. That man's head jerked back, and Michael felt a dull thud as bone or cartilage gave way. The corridor echoed with shouts. Michael glimpsed the leader rummaging for a weapon. A small blade flashed in the leader's hand. He slashed at Michael's torso, and the tip sliced open Michael's jacket. Michael reversed his grip on the shard and stabbed the leader's thigh. The leader cried out, dropping his knife. Michael realized he was outnumbered and needed to escape, so he turned to break away from the corridor. One more gang member tried to block his path. Michael tackled him, and the force of impact knocked them both against the rock wall. In the confusion, Michael drove the shard into the man's side. The man fell, and Michael sprinted down the passage, breathing heavily. He looked over his shoulder and saw the leader leaning against the wall, clutching his wounded leg. At least one of his followers lay unmoving on the ground. The others were moaning and rolling in pain. Michael felt the weight of the moment. He had taken a life. He had also severely injured the faction leader, an act that would carry serious consequences in the pit. He ran through the dim passages, weaving around boulders and slipping past inattentive lookouts. By the time he reached his hidden cave, he was gasping for air. His throat felt tight, and his chest heaved as he considered what had just happened. He understood that this act could spark a relentless hunt. He sat on his cot and removed his torn jacket, revealing a shallow cut on his side. He cleaned the wound with water from a plastic pouch. The sting reminded him that he was still alive. He slumped against the rough wall, anticipating the anger that would soon explode among the gang's members. He realized his next steps were crucial. This was no longer a matter of random theft or quiet survival. He had stirred a hornet's nest. His heart pounded and his mind raced. He checked his limited supplies, certain that it was only a matter of time before they came for him. He weighed his odds of finding a safer part of the pit or trying to hide in deeper tunnels. He understood there was no safe option. The pit was a closed world, and he had just made a significant enemy. Night fell without ceremony. At the rim of the pit, a heavy truck rolled to a stop, its engine rumbling beneath reinforced plating. A few guards stood near its doors, each armed with rifles and handheld spotlights. They did not bother with the wooden lift this time. Instead, they positioned themselves along the edge, hooked thick cables to an enormous iron container, and shoved it over the side. The box plummeted 20 feet before striking an outcropping, then tumbled another 10 yards, eventually slamming onto the rocky floor with a thunderous crash. Dust and shattered rock fragments erupted, rising in the stale air like a signal flare. Within minutes, curious inmates moved toward the sound. Iron was a rare commodity in the pit, and many believed they could strip the container for parts or transform it into shields or weapons. Tension spread through the small groups of prisoners who approached from different directions. Some carried crude implements, pipes, or sharpened rods, aware that competition over valuable materials often ended in bloodshed. The container's surface bore deep dents from the fall, but its seams remained intact. A group of 4 men circled the box, prodding it with metal bars to test for hidden compartments. They heard a faint scraping noise from within, like claws or nails raking the interior walls. Instead of retreating, they crowded around the reinforced corners. One of them pried at a small latch, hoping for a quick payoff. Another man hammered away at a hinge with a stone. They whispered among themselves, speculating about the contents. Some believed the guards had dropped new supplies or specialized tools. Others thought it might be a trick, another sadistic game to incite violence. They shared no consensus, yet greed outweighed caution. The scraping sounds continued, more insistent this time, as though something inside recognized the attempts at forced entry. Several onlookers stood at a safe distance, preferring to watch rather than participate. They heard a man cursing as he chipped away at a corner rivet. When part of the box gave way, a foul stench leaked out. It drifted across the stagnant air, causing a few men to recoil. The ones holding rods and stones paused, uncertain whether to continue. Then one of them, emboldened by the potential reward, slid a crowbar under the exposed seam and pried it open. Within a moment the stench intensified, thick and nauseating. The men coughed, some covering their faces with scraps of cloth. An uneasy silence followed. Then the box jerked from the inside, rattling with sudden force. The watchers froze, staring at the container. The scraping turned frantic, accompanied by muffled thuds that reverberated through the iron walls. As the men prepared to pry it further, the scene abruptly ended in confusion. The guards above switched off their spotlights, plunging that sector of the pit into near darkness. At dawn, a group of inmates investigating the site discovered the container torn apart. Its walls had been peeled outward, leaving twisted sheets of iron scattered across the ground. Several corpses lay nearby, barely recognizable. Limbs and torsos were shredded, as if subjected to fierce rending. A broken crowbar was found lodged in a jagged edge of the box. Blood splattered the dusty floor in wide arcs. The discovery caused immediate panic among the remaining population. Word traveled through every tunnel and cavern, reaching corners where news rarely spread. One rumor claimed that the guards had introduced a monstrous creature to cull the inmate count. Another rumor suggested something more supernatural. An unknown predator carried from a distant facility. People shared wild theories without tangible proof. Prisoners who prided themselves on bravery suddenly refused to wander alone. The few who had carved out small territories retreated closer to their allies, guarding entrances with sharpened stakes or crude booby traps. Even the big gangs, usually eager to assert control, showed caution. None of them had a clear explanation for the mangled bodies. Some insisted it was an attack by rival factions, but the nature of the wounds hinted at something else entirely. Throughout these developments, Michael remained in hiding. He had spent the nights lying low in his remote cave, ensuring his presence stayed invisible. He had no reason to approach the site of that crash, given his own troubles with a vengeful gang. He avoided large gatherings and listened for news from passing inmates, who spoke in hushed tones about the horrific display in the pit's center. He concluded that whatever was inside that box had been lethal enough to slaughter anyone reckless enough to pry it open. Though Michael did not fully grasp the extent of the threat, he recognized that tension in the pit was rising to a new level. Violence was not unusual, but the unexplained savagery unsettled even the most hardened killers. For now, Michael intended to continue evading his pursuers and minding his own survival. That single-minded approach had kept him alive this long. He expected that soon, however, circumstances would force him to confront the unknown terror. Michael spent 3 days confined to his cave, nursing minor wounds and rationing the limited provisions he had. He was aware that the gang he had provoked still wanted him dead. Yet isolation brought complications. Supplies were running low, and he needed to make a move before hunger or thirst weakened him. He decided to seek out his friend, a resourceful trader named Dixon, hoping to leverage an item he had stolen weeks ago, a small pouch of gunpowder, rare in the pit. Under cover of dim torchlight, Michael ventured into the network of passages leading to the black market. His goal was to remain hidden, so he avoided well-traveled corridors. He crawled through partially collapsed tunnels, squeezed through gaps where loose rocks threatened to bury him, and paused whenever he heard distant echoes of voices. Eventually, he reached the fringes of the market area. Something felt off. The once bustling zone was strangely subdued. Several stalls stood empty. The hush unsettled him more than any brawl would have. He spotted Dixon near a makeshift table, hurriedly packing small bottles into a sack. The trader looked anxious, glancing around as if expecting trouble. Michael approached carefully, scanning for watchers. When Dixon realized who stood behind him, he exhaled in relief, but urged Michael to keep his voice down. Dixon explained that people were terrified by a series of brutal killings. Those who discovered the battered iron box realized it contained some kind of creature, and at least 2 more savage deaths had occurred since. Dixon mentioned seeing half-eaten remains near a side tunnel. Everyone suspected the guards were behind it, but nobody knew their plan. Most inmates feared leaving their hiding places. The guards themselves seemed content to watch events unfold. Meanwhile, rumors of a second iron box had surfaced. Anxiety rippled through the pit, fueling paranoia and violence. Michael acknowledged Dixon's words, but told him that he had a more immediate concern. He still faced a death sentence from the gang he had attacked. He needed to negotiate protection or find an ally strong enough to counter that gang's influence. He revealed the small pouch of gunpowder, holding it out as proof that he had valuable currency to offer. Dixon studied the pouch, then nodded. Gunpowder in the pit was a major advantage, especially for a gang with ambitions to intimidate rivals. Dixon cautioned Michael that forging alliances during this climate of fear was risky. He knew of one group with enough resentment against Michael's enemies to consider a deal. However, they would demand a steep price and might betray him if circumstances changed. Michael accepted the risk. He had no other option. Before they parted, Dixon led Michael to a quieter corner and briefed him on the location of that group's hideout. Michael would need to travel deeper into an interconnected cluster of caves near a large underground pool. Dixon agreed to arrange a short meeting, but warned that they were jumpy about strangers. Michael thanked him, promising to repay the favor in any way he could. Then Dixon departed, anxious to relocate his merchandise and lie low. Michael made the return journey to his cave, moving with caution through echoing corridors. He noticed fresh graffiti scrawled on the walls, references to a demon dog or a monstrous beast with claws. He also spotted fewer roving inmates. People seemed to vanish into their hideouts, unwilling to roam. One man stumbled by, his face etched with tension. He mumbled warnings about seeing a massive shape dart across an intersection moments earlier. Reaching his cave, Michael set the gunpowder pouch on a flat stone and considered his next steps. The situation felt more volatile than anything he had experienced before. He recognized that the best strategy was to act quickly. Prolonged waiting would allow the gang to pinpoint his location, or worse, allow the unknown creature to appear without warning. He decided to focus on the upcoming negotiation. If he could gain temporary shelter by trading the gunpowder, he might create enough breathing room to outlast the immediate threat. He would handle the question of the new horror in the pit after securing his own safety. That night, he lay awake, listening for unusual sounds. Every distant shuffle in the darkness raised his anxiety. He realized the pit had evolved into something even more dangerous, overshadowed by an unseen predator. Despite his training, he felt vulnerable. Yet he reminded himself that he had endured harsh conditions before, and he intended to do so again. At dawn, he would leave for the rendezvous, prepared to risk his most precious resource in exchange for a shred of protection. Michael left his cave before dawn, choosing a winding path that skirted known gang checkpoints. He moved carefully, aware that at least 2 factions were hunting him. He reached a narrow passage where damp walls glistened under the minimal light from overhead fissures. He paused there, thinking he heard quiet footsteps. 2 men emerged, both wearing ragged shirts and carrying short blades. They belonged to the group that wanted him dead. He slipped into a shadowed alcove, pressing against wet stone. His heart pounded, but he remained motionless. The men lingered nearby, muttering about orders to capture or kill. Their voices sounded tense, possibly reflecting the growing panic in the pit due to unknown assailants. After a moment, one man suggested checking the next corridor. Footsteps receded. Michael intended to wait longer, but a sudden growl shattered the silence. It echoed down the tunnel, deep and guttural. The men shouted, followed by abrupt screams. The horrifying commotion lasted just a few seconds. Then everything went quiet. Michael clenched his fists and considered fleeing, but the risk of making noise was too great. He stayed put. When the silence persisted, he forced himself to investigate. He advanced slowly and found dark stains on the ground. There were scattered footprints leading deeper, though no bodies remained. This evidence suggested that the rumors of a vicious creature were true. Fear coursed through him, but he recognized that leaving the area immediately was wiser than standing around. He resumed his journey, keeping a watchful eye on every intersection. Hours later, he met Dixon near the mouth of a lower tunnel. Dixon looked agitated, explaining that overnight another iron box had been dropped into the pit. This time, some inmates claimed to have witnessed something tearing its way out from inside, then vanishing into the darkness. The news magnified the sense of dread, yet there was no turning back. Dixon guided Michael to the hideout where the prospective ally waited. The hideout stood behind a barricade of corrugated metal and broken beams. Guards armed with spears and makeshift crossbows stared suspiciously at Michael. Dixon explained the arrangement, but the guards insisted on seizing everything of value before allowing entry. They took the gunpowder pouch and roughly searched Michael for hidden weapons. Inside a dim chamber, Michael was confronted by a man flanked by 2 watchful sentinels. The man wore a stained jacket and had a deep scar across his brow. Michael attempted to introduce himself, but one of the sentinels struck him in the abdomen, causing him to stagger. The leader motioned for silence and demanded to see what Michael was offering. A guard handed him the pouch. Michael tried to keep his voice steady. He proposed an alliance. In exchange for the gunpowder, the group would offer temporary protection against the gang that sought him. The leader stared at the pouch, considering its implications. Gunpowder had the potential to create bombs or enhanced weapons, which could shift power in the pit. Before anyone could finalize a deal, another guard entered, whispering urgent news into the leader's ear. Apparently, the monstrous attacks were escalating, and multiple gangs had agreed to a temporary ceasefire. Michael's enemies were now part of that ceasefire, meaning the leader had no desire to antagonize them. He thanked Michael for the valuable pouch, but stated he would not interfere in the conflict. Michael realized he had been double-crossed. A swift blow knocked him to the ground. The guards kicked him until he felt his ribs protest. They wrenched his arms behind his back and bound him. Dixon tried to intervene, but was shoved aside. The leader declared they would deliver Michael as a gift to the rival gang, thereby avoiding any vendetta. Michael lay on the cold stone, helpless. They dragged him to a side chamber and locked him inside. The space was narrow, its walls damp and slimy. A feeble torch flickered near the entry, highlighting the fact that escape would be difficult. Rope burns stung Michael's wrists. He cursed his own desperation for trying such a naive plan. He had effectively handed his only leverage to a group that cared nothing for him. Outside, he heard the leader instructing men to contact Michael's enemies. Soon they would take him away and likely kill him. Hours passed while he wrestled with regret. He recalled how he once operated as a meticulous covert agent, always anticipating betrayal. Years in the pit had dulled that edge, leaving him vulnerable to false hope. He tried not to panic, forcing himself to breathe calmly and ignore the throbbing pain in his sides. Then, faint screams echoed from somewhere beyond the barricade. Men shouted, steel clashed on stone, and muffled detonations shook the cave walls. Something had attacked the hideout. Michael waited, realizing he had no means to fight back. All he could do was listen to the chaos outside, bracing for whatever came next. Michael lay face down on the rough floor, arms bound behind him, cursing his own carelessness. He had traded away the only real advantage he possessed. His chest hurt, and each breath reminded him of bruised ribs. He attempted to shift position, but the rope cut deeper into his wrists. The distant sounds of carnage intensified. Frantic footsteps, desperate shouts, and the guttural snarls of some unknown terror. He heard a sudden crack as the flimsy door to his makeshift cell split apart. A figure rushed in, breathing hard. It was Dixon, clutching a bent crowbar and frantically scanning the cramped space. Dixon knelt beside Michael and slashed the rope with a small knife. Michael winced but remained silent, trying to steady himself. Dixon urged him to hurry, explaining that the hideout had been overrun. They emerged into a corridor streaked with blood and debris. Several men lay on the ground, torn apart as though a wild animal had ripped them. A larger figure moved in the distance, hidden by flickering shadows. Dixon said there were now two such creatures roaming the pit. He had witnessed both. One had stormed this hideout, tearing through guards as if they offered no resistance. Everyone was too frightened to mount a coordinated defense. Michael saw the stolen pouch of gunpowder near a dead guard's outstretched hand. However, the guard's chest was torn wide, making any attempt to retrieve the pouch risky. A short distance away, the leader of the hideout was hurling desperate threats at the intruder. He lit a rag stuffed into a small tin can, presumably containing the precious gunpowder. Then he hurled it toward the monstrous shape bounding through the corridor. Michael and Dixon ran. Behind them came a sharp blast. The explosion rattled the walls, scattering dust and shrapnel. The sound hurt their ears, but they kept moving. Flames licked the lower part of the passage, igniting loose cloth and splintered wood. Screams of agony reverberated behind them. They found an exit that opened onto a broader tunnel. The floor was littered with broken weapons and spilled supplies. Michael spotted a half-crumbled walkway leading upward. They climbed it, coughing through acrid smoke and stepping over bodies. Above, a narrow archway offered a path back toward more familiar caverns. Pounding footsteps and echoing roars followed them. Pieces of the hideout collapsed, sending reverberations through the rock. Michael's side ached, and he labored to stay upright. Every step felt like a gamble. They finally escaped the immediate danger zone, pausing in a deserted corridor. Dixon leaned against a wall, struggling for breath. Michael realized that the threat in the pit was more real than any rumor. These beasts, with their canine features, possessed strength and agility far beyond normal predators. They slaughtered entire groups of hardened inmates, leaving little chance to fight back. He remembered news of multiple iron boxes dropped by the guards. He now suspected a grim intention behind those deliveries. They retreated to Dixon's hidden shelter. Inside, they barricaded the entrance with large rocks. Michael leaned against the wall, exhausted and shaken. Dixon began pacing back and forth, distressed by the carnage they had just witnessed. Michael stared at the flickering light of the small lantern, realizing that everything had changed. Unfortunately, Dixon's shelter was located not far from the marketplace, and this troubled Michael. From outside came muffled sounds of ongoing chaos. Distant shouts, scattered gunfire from improvised weapons, and the disturbing scrape of something heavy moving through the pit. Michael, still battered from the recent fight, sat on an overturned crate while Dixon rummaged for supplies. They had little food left, just a few cans of dried beans and a container of stale water. They each possessed a short blade, but neither believed these crude weapons would offer much help if the creatures attacked again. Their conversation was hushed, reflecting the tense atmosphere that now dominated the pit. After a few hours of uneasy rest, Michael concluded that staying in Dixon's chamber was too dangerous. If a band of survivors came looking for supplies, or if one of the beasts followed the lingering scent of blood in the tunnels, they would be cornered. He explained that he had a more isolated hideout on the pit's outer rim, far from the central passages. Though it lacked many amenities, it would provide better concealment and fewer potential intruders. Dixon agreed, recognizing that any chance to escape the central war zone might improve their odds of surviving. They gathered their meager belongings, small water flasks, the remaining food, and anything that could serve as a weapon or tool. Then they prepared for a journey through the collapsed sections and unguarded corridors. They hoped to avoid detection by any roaming inmates or the dog-like creatures, which Dixon had begun calling the Devourers. Michael nodded at the term. It felt accurate, given the gruesome remains they had seen. They left the chamber, stepping into what used to be the fringes of the marketplace. The sight that greeted them resembled a battlefield. Torn bodies lay scattered, and broken stalls had been reduced to smoking wreckage. Several fires burned out, leaving smoldering piles of ash. Occasionally, they saw a flicker of movement among the bodies, but no one appeared to be alive. A short distance away, Michael noticed a charred sign from the bar he had once visited. The entire structure had collapsed. They continued carefully, moving in short bursts from one piece of cover to the next. The pit's lighting was sporadic at best, with many torches extinguished or knocked over. Dixon held a small battery-powered flashlight he had traded for long ago, providing a narrow beam to guide them. The risk of attracting unwanted attention was high, but they needed to see where they were stepping. Near the remnants of a collapsed stall, they discovered the body of the gang leader who had been hunting Michael. His face was twisted in terror, and deep gashes streaked across his torso. Around him lay several of his men. Michael realized the vendetta was now irrelevant. This man's personal hatred had been overshadowed by a larger menace. Michael pointed out that, at least for now, they no longer had to worry about that gang's pursuit. Dixon agreed, though the relief felt hollow. A sudden impact from above made them freeze. Something crashed onto the stone floor not far ahead. The figure, battered and barely recognizable, emitted a sickening thud. Whoever it was had been dropped or flung from an unseen height. Michael and Dixon looked up, spotting a hulking shape clinging to the cavern wall. The creature's limbs extended unnaturally, and its fur bristled under the weak light. It resembled a monstrous wolf, yet it moved like a twisted version of a human. Saliva dripped from its jaws as it stared at them. They stepped backward, but another creature emerged from behind an overturned cart, blocking any retreat. The two beasts began to circle, their clawed hands scraping the stone and leaving marks. Michael tightened his grip on his blade, but he knew how futile it would be. Dixon crouched, eyes darting for an escape route that did not exist. The animals closed in, growling with a low rumble that shook the air. Michael felt his stomach clench. A wave of hopelessness settled over him as he realized they stood no chance in a direct encounter. The creatures, cunning and heavily muscled, prepared to spring. Before they could strike, a piercing whistle rang out. The sound reverberated through the chamber, loud and jarring. Both beasts halted, their ears flicking in response. Another whistle blast followed. The creatures twitched, snarled, then backed away, still watching Michael and Dixon. They retreated toward the cavern wall and climbed out of sight with terrifying ease. Moments later, the echo of a mechanical lift descended from above, accompanied by the raised voices of several guards. Spotlights swept the area, illuminating the wreckage. Michael and Dixon crouched behind a splintered beam, uncertain whether to reveal themselves. They watched as uniformed guards guided large iron cages that were lowered by chains. With firm gestures, the guards blew on the whistle again. The creatures reappeared, scaling down from hidden ledges and stepping into the cages as if following a trained command. The guards locked the containers and used hand signals to hoist them back up. The entire procedure unfolded with cold precision. Once the cages vanished into the darkness above, the guards departed without bothering to check for survivors. The hum of the lift faded, leaving silence in its wake. Michael and Dixon exchanged a tense glance. They realized these monsters were not random abominations, but part of some orchestrated plan. The pit was a testing ground, and the guards had full control. Suddenly, the perspective shifted. A cramped office full of surveillance monitors showed real-time feeds of every corner of the pit. Guards staffed rows of equipment, jotting down notes in thick logbooks. At the center, an officer oversaw the operation, quietly reviewing a large screen listing inmate statistics. A subordinate reported that the DOGMAN had achieved a set quota. Over half the pit's inhabitants were either killed or too traumatized to resist. The officer took notes, tapping a pen against a ledger labeled Phase 1 complete. Then he directed his staff to initiate the next stage of their plan.